This video is about a free standalone prologue for an upcoming release. It is intended for those who are at least moderately familiar with the game, ideally from playing it themselves. I highly recommend going in as blind as possible, but I always do, so that's at your discretion. If nothing else, it's about exploration and finding ways to reach your goal, and watching will diminish that and dull most major surprises. Also play Untitled 2 if you can. It's by much of the same team as The Big Catch, and that's relevant to my analysis. I'd recommend it before the Tacklebox, but either order works. Before saying anything, I'm obliged to at least acknowledge the game's performance, because refraining even for the sake of structuring this video better will feel like I'm neglecting it. The computer I have is what it is. The game clearly puts at least some effort into optimization, and there's a chance that it simply needs this much processing power to look and play how it does. While I was originally going to give more benefit of the doubt, I have since seen that it uses a lot of my GPU, which is far and away not my PC's bottleneck, which makes it seem more likely to me now that it could actually be poorly optimized. I cannot say for certain either way, and it's still possible that there are just some very expensive shaders involved that, if given some workable graphics options, would improve the frame rate considerably. Same for CPU-intensive lighting or something. I don't want to speculate too much because ultimately I can't know why it runs as it does, and I imagine it's a sore spot for the devs and, crucially, that they aren't sitting idle about it. The worst case scenario is that it's improved for the full release and the Tacklebox is never updated, which would be unfortunate but workable. The only relevance any of that truly has to this video is that sometimes the footage will drop to like 15 FPS. That may be unwatchable for some and is likely distracting for most, but I can't help it. On the bright side, at least you aren't the one playing it. Untitled 2 is all about platforming with the Noid's yo-yo, and as one would expect of a project of its scale, it's rather bare bones. The Noid can wall run and wall jump, and he can pull or swing on things with his yo-yo. Swinging has some momentum to it, although it's quite understated and underdeveloped. I can only imagine the difficulties of creating a system of momentum that feels good to play, and evidently those ambitions were reined in to get the game out the door at all. As far as I can tell, the Noid has a set walking speed which serves as a soft speed cap. It's not too hard to go faster than that by flinging or jumping off of a fast platform, after which the Noid is swiftly eased back to his walking speed. Options to go any faster are extremely limited, which makes momentum feel conditional and artificial. While it's fit for purpose, it's not remotely a core part of gameplay. The Big Catch is an obvious evolution of that concept. Momentum is baked into everything about movement, and Tackle is given many ways to take advantage of it. Merely walking down a slope is noticeably faster than on flat ground, and the frequency of Tackle's footsteps is a beautifully elegant and effective way to provide feedback on his velocity. There's more to momentum than that, of course, but this simple interaction gives it such prominence that it immediately feels fundamental to the game's physics. The Big Catch claims to have expressive movement, and I think it achieves that very well. It's a joy to move around and play with Tackle's abilities once accustomed to them. I do find that the slide feels cumbersome, however. It requires the player to press the crouch button and attack, and while crouch can be held to chain kick jumps together, this is an input redundancy. If it were up to me, I'd keep the double input slide, but also allow the player to use the left trigger to initiate it. A more radical change would be to make sliding automatic when the player crouches with more than a minute amount of speed, and/or while holding a direction. I'm not sure that's the best route to go, but the left trigger may have some other purpose in the full game which would make this more necessary. Camera sensitivity on both keyboard and controller, which could be rolled into one setting just fine I would imagine, barring any technical restrictions, is an obvious and fairly blatant omission. Same for rebindable controls. I almost feel bad including these in this video as I'm sure the developers are well aware of them, and there's a decent likelihood that they're watching. At the same time, to be blunt, it probably should have had this functionality years ago. Adjustable controls seem best done sooner rather than later. Making the camera frame rate independent on a mouse is important too, although it's feasible that decoupling it now would require an inordinate amount of effort gutting the engine. The actual controls are largely brilliant though. I adore the inclusion of a spin jump, and its modest amount of extra height combined with the fact that the spin persists after a ground pound jump is just delightful. Compared to Super Mario Sunshine, it's quite balanced. It's not the singular correct option in 80% of cases, because its low speed in lieu of a slope jump is often a downside. Spinning in midair is similarly very useful sometimes, yet often not as helpful as the player may hope, because it requires 2 spin puts to activate, during which a lot of speed is lost. It's impressively elegant. I'm not sure any part of Tackle's moveset feels superfluous, each ability having distinct roles and uses and some an unexpected amount of depth. Ground pounding a downward rail boosts Tackle's speed considerably, Noid 2 flings are still here, all that stuff about spin jumps. It's broadly very well tuned, and most everything flows into each other gracefully. Tackle can run on water, by the way. The biggest remaining criticisms I have are about the stop-and-go nature of shredder surfing and swimming. The latter feels a bit obligatory, as though it's mostly an input added for the sake of making it feel like the player is doing something. As far as I'm aware, the most complicated decision that it creates is whether or not to delay a boost for a moment so that Tackle exits water with the desired speed. It makes it feel clunkier all around, but even then there are balancing concerns with making boosts continuous. I don't find them a convincing argument against such a change, at least in the Tacklebox, but it's understandable that it's like this. Shredder surfing is the same sort of deal, although I feel less strongly about it than swimming. The roots of Noid 2 go a little deeper than the basic mechanical premise. They're present almost everywhere. The general atmosphere of the game is fairly similar to that of Domino Dungeon. Even some of the textures used in the Tacklebox's ruins look suspiciously familiar. It's a game about mystique and wonder in vast structures of an unknown purpose, conveyed through the medium of puzzling platforming, just as that level was. This atmosphere drives exploration by being decidedly inquisitive and contemplative, rather than compulsive or particularly energetic. This gets at a larger point, so I'll take a step back and explain from the ground up. The player is dropped into the short tutorial section at the beginning of the game, which teaches most basic mechanics. Bale, through signs and speech, gives Tackle directions on how to clear it, and then offers the shredder whistle so that he can spread out on the plateau proper. The only directions given to him, and the player by extension, are to find and catch fish and to be observant and clever with how the environment can help traversal. At least at the beginning of the game, that's the only goal. The only extrinsic motivators are fish and the coins they're traded in for. With no apparent purpose to coins, the extrinsic motivation is very weak, and since no real direction is given otherwise, the Tacklebox relies almost exclusively on intrinsic motivation to keep a player interested. That's a really hard sell. If the player doesn't instantly fall in love, and I certainly didn't, they have to trust that the game will eventually end up being a good time. This is where the aforementioned inquisitive and contemplative exploration comes in. The Tacklebox is quiet, slow, and moody. It wants the player to enjoy learning the limits and capabilities of their moveset through experimentation, and to relish the opportunity to merely see the views and architecture that these places hold, just because. The process is the goal, and love of exploration the premise. The way that I approach computer games leads to stuff like the beginning of my first playthrough. I bumbled around in the tutorial for all of 10 minutes, then turned around to walk down a lengthy path that I didn't expect to lead anywhere. 5 minutes later, when it voided me out, I was content with that. Sating my curiosity about how long the path is or if it has any purpose was reward enough, and the game threw in its beautiful moon and a delightful nighttime palette as a bonus. I think a player on some level has to have a similar mindset to enjoy this game casually. I was there just to see things and mess about with the gameplay, and the Tacklebox caters to that sort of attitude. I have a hunch that the word explore has been a bit warped for computer games, used in many cases to refer to the act of engaging with a game and a little more. Being exposed to new artistic experiences is exploration of a kind, but I wouldn't consider it to have the same active curiosity as real-life spatial exploration. The attitude of the latter being what the Tacklebox encourages and embodies. Level design is built to facilitate that. The player is expected to be an active participant in curiosity rather than a passive one, be it through navigation, mechanics, or both, and to that end difficulty is high. In the Garden Temple, I was kind of enamored with how sprawling and intricate the space felt, bolstered by flinging up to a side platform here rather than the pole on the opposite end, which negated some of the linearity of the area. The manner in which this prompted me to focus both on micro and macro level exploration was very gratifying. Other areas execute the mechanical side of this premise better, I'd say. The second one I visited post-tutorial, Slopeville, is considerably less guided. While the Garden Temple has comparatively apparent paths that it wants the player to take, Slopeville comes across less restrictive even if, I assume, both are susceptible to skips through clever play. I'd say these styles are used in roughly equal part, and I adore them. On top of all that, coins serve a few purposes. Sometimes they guide a player forward, other times they reward exploration, and often they serve as standalone challenges. It's the last type that I'm most partial to. They're an elegant way to get the player to learn the mechanics, and they're usually fun besides. Ignoring the numbered door, I think these are the strongest that extrinsic motivators get. A lot of these places have no reason to be reached, even if the player likes messing about for no reward. I think they function well as an excuse to further engage with the Tacklebox for those willing. While Ultra Kills collectibles encourage heightened care and scrutiny for any given stage, the Tacklebox asks for that care regardless, with the coins simply feeding into it further. The only reason that any of this works as well as it does is the versatility of Tackle as a player character. Tackle's moveset and his abilities when interacting with stage elements are built with a lot of synergy and nuance. The resulting variety of play means that ingenuity and experimentation matter. Different maneuvers are expected of the player frequently. It doesn't just rely on the same couple of moves all the time. It creates a symbiosis with the level design, mutually enabling each aspect's existence. The levels are difficult, which enables both the atmosphere of perilous exploration and the need to experiment with Tackle's moveset. The moveset both enables the game to be enduringly challenging while avoiding absurd frame precision because it has so many types of challenge at its disposal, and it feeds into exploration by adding noise to platforming puzzles. Read the on-screen text for a brief explanation of what that means. The atmosphere makes both other components feel much more weighty and personal. Almost everything coheres brilliantly to form the experience I've attempted to describe, and the Steam page should really mention that premise. This game seems to expertly bring out armchair critics and people who completely fail to engage with what I think it's going for, then turn around to blame that on supposed designer incompetence. A game revolving around an atypical mode of interaction is going to read to many as being shoddy if they expect something more standard, and the Steam page doesn't combat this. Perhaps I'm holding on to undue hope, but I hate to see such a beautifully crafted game written off as having careless level design because the developers allegedly suck at guiding players. I've tried my damnedest to communicate just how much care and finesse there is, and I believe players would be more likely to see it too if they were better primed. The game itself shouldn't be changed for this. I think it's fine and communicates itself well if the player is receptive to it. I'm only proposing changes be made to the Steam page. I don't mean to be inflammatory to those who need to be told that they can explore freely, instead of simply assuming that in lieu of direction. I believe it's a symptom of game design trends and popular analysis, where everything is about strongly catering to the player. That's what is deemed good game design, and it's difficult to keep an open mind after such heavy and persistent conditioning. In any case, my reading of the game is just my reading. It may well not be in line with the intent of the developers or the experiences of other players. That entire last paragraph about the Steam page is heavily speculative too. I'd be really embarrassed if either are dreadfully wrong, but I think it's worth saying all this anyway, if only to provide a novel, perhaps insightful lens to view the Tacklebox through. Heady stuff aside, not every part of the game exhibits this design philosophy so intensely. The Springy Zone, Grassy Island, Net Tower, and a couple other bits are more traditionally approached, although none of them exclusively so. For instance, the Grassy Island is action-focused until the Bell Mortar is dead, at which point it plays more akin to the Garden Temple. The Springy Zone and Net Tower have puzzly bits off to the side of their action elements. This is true even of Cube, which manages to include a hidden crevice despite how simple and singular it is. While I think the more meditative and observational style is better suited to the game, the Springy Zone is one of the highlights for me, likely just as much due to its delightfully intense music as the novelty of moving obstacles and my adoration of high speeds. The incredibly quick jump and swift stop feel lovely. Tackle's feedback and feel is phenomenal. The Grassy Island probably should have shared the Springy Zone track, although it getting the generic Ruins theme is a bit more understandable if the intent is to give it a unique song and an update. Regardless, the area is reminiscent of Swing Factory given its focus on moving parts, and I think it's fairly clever with them in its short length. Climbing this big gear is one of its more puzzling moments, which is a neat way to use the same obstacle twice. Once as an action obstacle, once for a small puzzle. Its former purpose obscures the latter in a sense by implicitly suggesting that it's already been used and can safely be ignored once passed. Doubly so if the player is immediately distracted by the fish and doesn't think to get back up to it. The Tacklebox as a whole feels decidedly similar to Wind Waker. The open overworld with sailing, the day-night cycle with strong and plentiful color palettes, the myriad landmarks always on the horizon, this Dark Tower in particular. That areas vary so much in size and contents adds to this, as the plateau would feel like a glorified level select if they were more homogeneous. Instead, it feels fairly natural, just a big space with some stuff dotted around. The game's tendency to be so quiet is a big contributor to that similarity too. Much of the music is understated, largely letting the spaces speak for themselves and leaving some emotional breathing room while still setting the mood. It usually isn't unrelentingly intense, instead showing an appropriate amount of restraint. The Garden Temple, for example, has a few variants of its theme. The exterior is a simple short loop with a plinky melodic percussion. It's so bare that it doesn't make that much of an impression, but it is a tad less whimsical than other tracks tend to be. The interior is more intense, raising the tempo and adding several instruments over the loop. It goes from mostly curious yet wary to outright intimidation. Both variations emphasize the enormity of the temple in their own way, the more active interior calling attention to how daunting a task it is to climb, and the less pronounced exterior stepping aside so the player soaks in just how high up they are, how much open air surrounds them. The transitions, made possible by the fact that this game uses an internal sequencer, are a great touch too. And this moment where the music transposes up a little and shifts to ambient synth-heavy instrumentation as the player gets a look at the beautiful garden up here. It's fantastic. The generic Ruins theme is nice and moody and does its job well. I think for the particularly small areas it maybe should have been omitted, similar to Wind Waker, for the same sort of effect as the Garden Temple's exterior variant. It would cut down on the repetition of that song besides. Most other full tracks follow that understated and moody precedent, except the energetic sailing music, seemingly an homage to Wind Waker, and again the Springy theme. That it's an exception only serves to make it more special, however. While it makes little sense for some random area to get such an emotional and dramatic song, fuck it. The energy it brings is a lot of fun. The ending sequence and its accompanying music are perfect. The sights are wonderful, the vibe a somber, bittersweet step to the future, the whole climb a lovely buildup of anticipation for whatever may await the player at the top. There's a palpable finality to it that abstains from bombast, and I adore the feelings that evokes. The only thing I dislike is the placement of the checkpoint. The bonus view at the true top of the tower is a fun and cheeky challenge, but the tedium of repeating everything before the spiral buoy room is pretty bad. I really think the checkpoint should have been here, because this is roughly where the actual platforming starts. Before this, it's not really possible to fail or speed it up, so it feels a little too monotonous. It truly isn't that big a deal though, the view up there is worth so much. Despite my praise, this ending has a bit of a strange role, being a reward for 100% completion in a game that is otherwise completely void of any non-immediate extrinsic rewards. Again, while collectibles are extrinsic motivators, they don't function that way very strongly on their own. That relationship shifts once the door is discovered, and while it worked fine for me personally, I think for a lot of people it might turn the coins into a burden. Perhaps an insurmountable one depending on the player and their progress. If any game were going to eschew the convention of winning, I would have thought it to be this one. I consider it an aberration in an otherwise exceptionally coherent work, yet I don't see it as a flaw per se. It's a decisive choice and conflicting to think about. Ultimately, admittedly, I like it. Still, the tower is fantastic, and I don't want or mean to distract from that. The ending as a whole is underwhelming, which I think is to the game's benefit. It's meditative just as the platforming and atmosphere were. The Tacklebox entails Tackle's scaling, which I understand as a coming-of-age ritual. This is why random poles and such are dotted around. The plateau seems to be where this ritual occurs, a proving ground for Fisker to become Fiskari. As such, these ruins are literally designed to be at the reasonable edge of a Fisker's abilities, so difficult as to prove their deafness and earn the Fiskari title. This is the final element to tie everything in the Tacklebox together. The narrative is almost identical for the player and for Tackle. The atmosphere and gameplay approach is nearly one-to-one. There's barely any plot, yet the game still manages to make the narrative immersive and resonant entirely through play. I really do mean it when I say that almost every single part of the Tacklebox is oriented towards the same goal. As much as I maintain fallibility in my reading, there's still a legitimately impressive cohesion here, even if it's coincidence. Anyway, a ceremony is presumably in Tackle's near future, but the player isn't shown that. Instead, once it's all over, they're left with whatever feelings they derive from the experience and the knowledge that it's ended. No cutscene, no fade to black, Tackle is clad in his new outfit and congratulated by Bale, and standing on the plateau. I spent an hour and a half getting to the true top of the tower before speaking to Bale, so I can never truly know how I'd feel beating the game and having that reflective moment to soak it in. Preceding it with a tedious grind, not an insult mind, is naturally going to take someone out of that experience and dull the emotions they'd otherwise have. Those emotions will likely be replaced with different ones, but doing that grind immediately doesn't seem to me like it fosters the most fulfilling or emotional outcome, so I see it as a bit of a shame that I did it this way. If you didn't get sucked into that grind, I'd like to hear how you felt at the end. I think there are bound to be emotionally complex and potent experiences from some players. As phenomenal as the Tacklebox is, I don't expect the Big Catch to quite capture the same thing. I would imagine that game will be more structured, more plot-heavy, and maybe it won't have many traces of the patience and observation-focused exploration at all. I'd happily take more Tacklebox, but ultimately this is a free 10-hour game that expertly embodies a kind of outlook on exploration which I adore. Whatever the full game may be, I'll likely enjoy it, and if it doesn't scratch the same itch, I'll always have the Tacklebox. The same is true if somehow the Big Catch never releases at all. We still got a great game out of the project. Oh, and please don't inform me of the direction of the full game. I want to avoid spoilers as much as possible, and the only reason I played the Tacklebox was because someone told me with no details whatsoever that it's a standalone prologue. I would not have played it otherwise. We may have known a year ago that the Big Catch was going to be open world, for example, but I don't know that and don't want to unless I'm actively playing the game once it's released. I consider knowing almost anything a spoiler, so again, please don't tell me that stuff. Yeah. You know, I'm not an authority on computer game analysis. My qualifications for writing it are that I've played them lots and I've listened to and read a good bit of analysis from others. Not tremendously remarkable, except maybe my thoughtfulness and writing quality, if you consider those notably good. The point of this video, and what should be the point of every analysis video, is to present my thoughts for a hypothetical audience to consider. You, as the audience, should listen to what I'm saying as a way to inform your own perspective, not to supplant it verbatim. It should be reflected upon, not taken as a given. While I've tried my best to provide analysis that I believe is substantial and potentially even useful for the developers, it is strictly something to be reflected upon. A lot of problems arise from treating these as a final word, or worse, as objective evaluations. Much of that responsibility falls on the author to treat their analysis fairly, which on YouTube is woefully uncommon. But the viewer shares a responsibility here. These videos are points in a discussion, even if the authors don't view them that way, so they should be treated as such. Be mindful about this stuff. Speaking of, I'd like to state that I technically do have an existing connection to the developers of this game, as for a day or two I was a tester on Yonoid 2's final patch. I did not back the Big Catch's Kickstarter, though I would have liked to, and I do not believe that my perspective on the game is biased in any meaningful way as a result of this. I am not a tester for the Big Catch, nor have I been in any substantial contact with anyone involved in making either game in 6 years. Take this all for what you will. Anyway, if you haven't played the subject of an analysis, try not to spread the talking points therein from that uninformed position as though you're more informed than you are. In his recent critique of Penny's Big Breakaway, a game I have not played and don't intend to, Shugels makes a brilliant point on this front. His video, measured and fair as I think it is necessarily misrepresentative. The only way you can know what a piece of art is truly like is by engaging with that piece of art yourself. No matter how good a third-party analysis and/or summary is, it cannot be a replacement or stand-in. If you have not played the Tacklebox, which you really should if you can, even now, then you should not speak on the game's behalf. Do not say that the game is good or has certain flaws. Instead, say you've heard that it's enjoyable or that it may have those flaws, but make it at least reasonably implicit that you're not sure of it yourself. Likewise, be cautious about art discourse canon. A lot of times, simplified and warped narratives become dominant, sometimes obscuring genuine value or flaws in favor of what is, at the end of the day, nonsense. Earnest art is too precious to treat so flippantly.